Hello, and rest assured there'll be more of that cute dog in just a moment, but first of all we're going to do our 6 starter questions. The first one of which is, why do we not have complete fossil records? 2, why do only some random genetic mutations get passed on? 3, how many chromosomes are there in a diploid cell? 4, how many divisions occur during meiosis? 5, how are hormones transported around the body? And 6, how do we separate a salt from solution? Okay, good. First one, we don't have complete fossil records for one of 3 reasons. Either they've been destroyed, they never formed in the first place, or we simply haven't found them yet. Only some mutations get passed on because they need to be an advantage in order for that species to be more likely to survive, more likely to breed, and more likely to pass that on to its offspring. If it's a disadvantage, it's more likely to die out and it won't get passed on. Diploid cells have 46 chromosomes. Four cells are produced during meiosis, so you have 2 divisions. Hormones are transported around the body in the blood, and then a salt will dissolve in solution, so you need to use crystallization to get it out. Good. So if our last lesson and last week we looked at evolution and how that process of a random genetic mutation getting passed on occurs in order to get the most adapted and best version of an organism or species possible, today we're looking at selective breeding, which is very similar, but it's where we, as an animal right at the top of the food chain, pick which species or organisms should be bred together in order to promote desirable characteristics. So not necessarily the best characteristics, making the best, most adapted version of that animal, but instead the characteristics we like best or we think are most desirable. So let's have a little look at an example of some selective breeding. And Sunny, being a pedigree Cocker Spaniel, is the result of years and years of selective breeding. And we've bred her to have all the characteristics that we like most in a dog, whether it's these big floppy ears, or the temperament that lets me hold her and give her a scratch, or her colouring. It's all a result of us picking characteristics we like most and promoting them. And these are not necessarily the characteristics that are best for Sunny. They might in actual fact mean that she's less likely to survive out in the wild. Okay, so hopefully having had a little look at Sunny there, we can see why those characteristics are desirable, but now we need to understand just how that process of selective breeding took place in order to end up with the finished product. So what we need to know is how we've gone from something that looks like this, a big scary wolf, into something that looks a little bit more like Sunny. Okay, and we've gone from a wolf which is perfectly adapted and has all the best characteristics to something like Sunny, which has all the most desirable characteristics. And this works in a similar way to evolution, in that there was a random genetic mutation for something that we like those nice floppy ears. And we chose that. We said it was desirable, and so we promoted it. We took an animal with that desirable characteristic. We found another version of that animal with the same desirable characteristic, and we bred them together. And because of the way genetics and inheritance works, that meant the offspring were much more likely to have that same desirable characteristic. So we got what we wanted. And then over time, another mutation would occur to give us an even more desirable characteristic. And eventually we end up with the version of Sunny we see today that we refer to as man's best friend, because we've bred for behaviour as well as characteristics. However, in doing this selective breeding, we're also promoting undesirable characteristics because we are diluting the gene pool. And this is why pugs have breathing problems and dogs like Sunny have heart defects and things like that. And we'll look at that a little more in just a second. The 2 dogs have the same random genetic mutation, the chances are against that, unless of course they're related. And so when we pick characteristics we like floppy ears or temperament, we are putting together organisms or animals that are probably slightly more closely related than they should be. So we are, by selectively breeding like this, we are causing a degree of inbreeding. And over generations and generations, as pedigree dogs are, that problem becomes greater and greater. They become more and more inbred, and that's why pedigree dogs often have lots of health defects. And Cocker Spaniels like Sunny, they tend to suffer from kidney problems or heart defects, which shorten their expected lifespan. And other dogs have different problems. So we ended there by looking at some of the problems attached to selective breeding, and they all come from the idea that to have two species with the same desirable characteristic, the chances are they're more likely to be related in some way. And as that process continues and you get more and more closer to your perfect version, your most desirable version, you're reducing that variation more and more, and so they're more likely to be closer and closer and closer related. And pedigree dogs are incredibly closely related. There's lots of inbreeding there, and inbreeding leads to a reduction in the gene pool, which means there's much less lovely variation, and so you get a rise of undesirable characteristics and birth defects. This is why these animals struggle to breathe or have heart difficulties or problems with their hips, because they are inbred essentially. And another problem with this small gene pool is that an organism's immunity is affected. They'll all have very similar immunities, immune systems, and so one disease can really massively affect that organism or that species. It means there's much less diversity of immunity, and so one disease can spread through them very, very quickly. Okay, now these problems with selective breeding are a problem because they affect the quality of life for that animal, and so some people would say that it's cruel to do this. But these problems become much less significant when we're talking about selectively breeding plants or crops. So the reason when you go to the supermarket and buy apples and carrots and other things, that they look exactly the same and they taste very similar, is because for years and years and years we've selectively bred our plants and our vegetables and our fruit in order to give the best appearance and best taste. And when we do this, you don't tend to have those same problems with health defects and the such, and so it's less of a significant thing when you're selectively breeding plants. Okay, good. So now let's have a little look at an exam question on this topic before coming back here for the end of the lesson. Okay, so this is a tough 6-mark question where it talks about selective breeding of a bulldog. Gives you a nice helpful picture of a bulldog, and it says that they often have to be born by a caesarean operation and that they often have breathing problems. And it goes on to say that some people think the breeding of bulldogs should be banned because of these health problems, and then to discuss these reasons for and against. So this is a tough question where really it wants you to talk a little bit about selective breeding in general, and higher level students will explain where these problems come from. So the first thing we can say here is that selective breeding is breeding for desired characteristics. Even if you don't get a mark for this, it shows that you know what's going on, which helps you out in the long run. Okay? Then this results in a reduction in the gene pool. And this is a key phrase that shows I'm a top student, I know what a gene pool is, I know that selective breeding reduces it. And this means harmful variations are more likely. Okay, I know where these come from, I know the problems. Harmful mutations are more likely because of this reduction in the gene pool. Okay, so then go on to say this means more harmful characteristics. This is where they come from. I've got more bad things for my animal, like my breathing problems. It all comes from this lack of variation, this lack of diversity. But then these are these are the problems with it. Why do people worry about this? Well, they would say it is unethical to breed in this way. That it's cruel because the animal has a low quality of life at the end of it. Other people, however, others would say health problems are small. A caesarean is a fairly routine operation most of the time. It's unlikely to kill it. The breathing problems, while can be significant, they don't necessarily affect the animal's overall quality of life. And then the key thing, the key argument against this is that selective breeding has been around for a long time. And because of this, the bulldog, as we see it today, is entirely a result of selective breeding. So to stop would mean the death of the species or extinction of it. You wouldn't get these occurring naturally. So for that species to continue, we need to keep selectively breeding. And if that's what we want to happen, we need to do it this way. Okay, with these questions, sometimes it's good to come to a conclusion. You could say your opinion at the end, but you don't necessarily have to unless it uses the word evaluate. Good, so that's us done. Next lesson we're going to look at how we go about predicting inheritance of genes so that we can see whether we're likely to get one of these desired or indeed undesired characteristics. Thanks very much for watching. Bye-bye.